Hi, Justin with Spalta's Stag Studio. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a simple Dado sled. Normally for your table saw sled, you're going to want to use a piece of 3/4 inch Baltic birch. However, for this build, I'm going to make replaceable inserts, so I'm going to use 2 layers of 1/2 inch Baltic birch. The base layer, which will be the full size of the sled, is going to be 34 inches by 28 inches. The second layer will be composed of 3 pieces, one of which being our replaceable insert. So we're going to go with 4 inches on that replaceable insert, so the remaining 2 pieces will be 15 inches wide. Even with Baltic birch, you can get some variations from each sheet of plywood. It's never much, but considering this is a 0 clearance insert, and it's going to go on this sled, any little bit, even if it's a hair, is going to stand out and require sanding. So we're just going to cut a bunch of these right now, and then we don't have to worry about it. Next, I'm going to apply 2 layers of clear box tape. I'm going to be real careful and make sure that there's no creases and it's laying perfectly flat. Keeping our fence at the exact measurement that it was when we ripped these inserts down, we're going to go ahead and make a pass. This will essentially remove the exact thickness of those 2 pieces of tape. And I know it's a little confusing, but I promise it'll make sense once we do the glue up. Now before we actually glue up, we're going to reapply a single layer of tape on each side and a whole layer of tape on the bottom, making sure there is no visible wood. The tape will prevent any wood glue from sticking to this template piece. The template should keep everything in line and prevent any glue from squeezing out into the insert area. As I started clamping things together, I realized it was moving around a little too much for my comfort. So I removed the template, applied some painter's tape, and some CA glue to hold in place. And honestly, that probably wasn't really necessary, because in the end, we're just going to clamp everything flush together with some longer pipe clamps anyways. But with how much glue I'm applying and how much I'm moving around, I just didn't want to risk it slipping around and getting glue into the template area. In my opinion, this is one of those situations where you can never have enough clamps. So I pretty much use every clamp I have to make sure that everything's clamped nice and tight, and then I'll apply some weight in the middle to make sure the middle is pushed down nice and tight. This would be a lot easier with a vacuum press, which if you've never seen before or heard of, it's definitely worth checking out. There are some smaller ones available, and those things are great. There's a commercial shop down the street that uses one that he built himself, and that thing is amazing. In this step, I made a pretty big mistake, and it didn't really surface till later on in the build, and then it took an embarrassing long time to figure out what actually caused the issue. A lot of times for smaller things like this, I like to use these risers that I made to give me some lift and make applying the clamps a lot easier. And for some ridiculous reason, I chose to use 2 of these risers, and I spaced them really far apart. So as I started applying clamps, and the weight started increasing in the center, it caused it to bow quite badly. And unfortunately, I didn't notice any of this until I actually started working on the fence, even though I can clearly see it now in the video that that was the root cause of the issue. Next, we can mark our holes for our screws that will attach the removable inserts to our sled. I'll be marking these holes 3/4 inch from each side, and then every 4 inches. I'm trying to keep everything nice and whole, that way it's easily remembered and I can reference it later when I'm building more of these inserts. Once we get everything laid out, we can use a Forstner bit and make a countersink for our bolt heads. You don't need to go very deep, just deep enough that the bolt head isn't going to protrude out past the wood. Once we get those drilled, we'll put the insert back into the sled and use those holes as guides to drill holes for our threaded inserts into our sled. For the threaded inserts, I went with some M8s I got off Amazon. However, I really wasn't a fan of these. They're driven in with a flat head, and it's just not a really good mechanism to drive these in. The hex head ones go in much smoother, and they don't slip as much as this flathead one did. Since I'll be using wood for the skis on this sled, I have to pay close attention to the grain direction. If we cut the skis out as the wood's sitting now, That wood can move through the seasons. If it's sitting like this, it's going to expand outwards or inward, and it's either going to make the sled too tight or too loose, and we're not going to get accurate cuts. So we'll just flip our piece 90 degrees. That way the grain direction will expand and contract going up and down. This will prevent our sled from binding. I started by planing that piece of wood down to about a half an inch. I then took it over to my table saw and ripped it down to slightly over 3/4 of an inch. That will make it slightly bigger than the miter slots in my table saw. Once I do that, I can take it over my workbench, clamp it down, and use my hand plane to get a nice tight fit. Next, I'll lay down some pennies in my miter slot and put the skis into the miter slot. This will make them slightly protrude past the top of my table saw. Next, I found the center of my sled and then used that as a reference point to set my fence. Now I can butt my sled up onto the fence and get it somewhat square to my blade. I can then apply some CA glue to my skis and go ahead and drop my sled on. Now you could use activator onto your sled to make this dry a lot faster. However, I wanted to give myself some time to make any kind of adjustments, so I just let it cure naturally. Once it cures, we'll flip it over and apply some screws. I'm going to countersink these a little deeper than I would normally, and this is just a precautionary measure so I don't scratch my table saw. The back fence was just made with some offcut of the fence that we glued together earlier, and I'm going to put a little round over on this just so I don't have sharp corners and I don't tear up my hands when I'm moving this around. Now I can glue the rear fence onto the sled. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered. As long as it's close, it only serves one purpose, and that's to stop the sled from breaking into two pieces when we cut it. I'm going to put some T-track into my fence, so I'm going to use that as a reference and make a dado that's just slightly deeper than the T-track. And this is where I realized my mistake. As I was cutting the dado, I realized that the piece wasn't completely square against the fence. After an embarrassing amount of time, I realized that the piece was completely bowed and absolutely unusable for this project. So I decided to start completely over. This time I went ahead and used some metal brackets that I had laying around that I know are very straight. Although this made clamping a little more difficult, with an extra pair of hands, it wasn't that bad, and I now know it's absolutely straight. Installing the T-track is a straightforward process. I just cut it to length, and then I'll use a center punch to punch some holes. That way the screws find the center easier and don't flop around and cause me to throw things. For the inserts on the fence, we're going to use the exact same process as we did for the base, although the measurements did change a little bit on this. Before we go any farther, I'm going to give everything a light sanding with some 120. Now, I don't want to make it too smooth. I have done that in the past, and I don't like how easy it is for your pieces to slide around on the sled. So I like to keep it a little rough, that way it has some grip. Next, I'm going to put it on the table saw and make a pass. Now, I'm not going to go all the way through. I'm going to stop about 1.5 inches, 2 inches from the very end. Once I do that, I can use my Cat's Moses fence jig and square my fence up to my sled. I can then use 4 screws and attach the fence to the sled. I'll make sure that one of the screws is somewhat near the center of the fence, and that'll be used as a pivot point if we have to make any adjustments. I'm going to use something called the 5-cut method to test the squareness of the fence. I'm not going to go over that in too much detail because there's a bunch of information online about that. And if you go to the Cat's Moses site, he actually has a calculator to tell you exactly how much you need to adjust. So I'll take some measurements, go to that calculator, input those numbers, and it'll tell me how much I need to adjust my fence. That adjustment ended up being 0.006 of an inch forward. So I'll use my feeler gauge, find the 0.006 of an inch thickness, clamp a board with the feeler gauge to my fence, remove the feeler gauge, unscrew my fence, and then butt my fence up against that board. So now I've moved my board forward 0.006 of an inch. I repeated the 5-cut method again, and this time this piece came out with the exact same measurements on both ends, which means that that fence is perfectly square. Now that we got our crosscut sled all done, we can move on to setting up our dado blade. Now some dado blades come with a guide that give you an idea of what kind of shims to use to achieve a specific measurement. Mine, however, did not, so we're going to go ahead and make that guide now. And if you're not too familiar with the dado blade, that's going to be composed of 2 outer blades and then some chip breakers. Now these are designed in a way that the blades will actually overlap the chip breakers and the chip breakers will overlap the other chip breakers. So you can't just take a measurement of each blade and add that together to get a measurement of the thickness of your dado. And that's where the shims come into play. You use those to move over the chip breakers just enough to give you whatever measurement you're looking for. Now we're not going to worry about the shims as of yet. We're just going to focus on the blades and the chip breakers. So right now I'm going to start with the 2 outer blades and 1 chip breaker. I'm going to make a pass with that on a scrap piece of wood and take a measurement of that dado and record it. Now keep in mind that different brands of dado blades can be very, very different than the one I'm using now. This is a Diablo, which I'm not too big of a fan of. I'd preferably like to get a higher end one eventually, but this is what I have now, so we're going to make this work. After making that first pass, I'll go ahead and take everything apart and add another chip breaker. I'll then repeat this process, doing the same thing for the 3rd chip breaker. And my measurements came out to this. 1 chip breaker is 0.365. 2 chip breakers is 0.534, and 3 chip breakers is 0.607. Now that we got the measurements for our chip breakers, we can go ahead and take some measurements on our shims. For the Diablo dado set, we ended up with 5 different shims. Those measurements are 625 thousandths, 210 thousandths, 120 thousandths, 8 thousandths, and 4 thousandths. Now, one of the really frustrating things about tools like this is that they're manufactured across seas, and they're manufactured in metric measurements. They're then converted into imperial measurements and rounded to whatever specification the manufacturer says. And for most things, that's probably just fine. However, for a dado blade, it's a little frustrating because I can't get to the exact measurements that I use. For example, with the given measurements, I can't get to exactly half an inch. It's going to get to 0.502. Same thing with 3/4 of an inch. The closest I can get to is 0.752. And really, 2 thousandths isn't a lot. However, when you're looking at a tight-fitting joint, that 2 thousandths is a difference of it fitting and it not fitting, or it being a seamless joint and it having a gap. And I know what you're thinking, just use the metric system. Well, honestly, I would love to. It's much simpler to use than dealing with all the fractions and stuff, but it's honestly an unreasonable expectation. Unless the United States completely transfers to that, which they're not going to anytime soon, I can't just switch my measurement systems because it's easier. This is what all my customers are going to expect. This is what I'm going to receive from any kind of contractor that I'm working with. So I have to stick to this measurement system. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.